The plasma-shielded drop pod of the Vanguard slammed into Earth's surface, shattering the bone-dry, unshielded crust of California. My fire control computers flashed a manic green. I stood on the deployment ramp, my chest swelling with the arrogant thrill of slaughtering a lesser civilization. But the second the pneumatic valves hissed open, our flawless higher-dimensional conquest slammed face-first into a biochemical wall of pulverized, highly toxic fish bones and cheap agricultural fertilizer. There was no retaliatory laser fire, no anti-air missiles. There was only the Salton Sea. The suffocating stench of rotting fish and hydrogen sulfide hit me, thick enough to liquefy a carbon-based organism's internal organs. It instantly choked out my high-dimensional respiratory filtration core. As an apex predator who had conquered 3 star systems, my 6 lungs were suddenly convulsing like they'd been shoved into a wood chipper. I dropped to my knees on the ramp. Fighting through the searing agony of acidic salt dust burning my optical sensors, I looked ahead. Standing next to a beat-to-hell Ford RV was a shirtless, leathery-skinned old earthling, casually puffing on a dirt-cheap cigarette. He peered through a yellow haze of toxic smog that was actively eating my star-forged armor, looking at my fully armed chassis like I was an absolute moron. He didn't even cough. He just rolled his eyes, turned around, and smashed a heavy wrench into his leaking diesel generator. I hunched over, hacking violently. Green, acidic biofluid spewed from my breathing valves, splattering across my gleaming kinetic chest plate and etching dark, corrosive pockmarks into the metal. Behind me, 5 battle-hardened elite operatives dropped heavily onto the scorching, acid-laced salt flats before they could even scream. Their plasma shields, cranked to maximum output, were completely useless. That hyperfine toxic salt dust bypassed the molecular gaps in the energy fields, flooding straight into their life support filtration loops. The fault alarms on my HUD blinked so fast they practically caught fire. The health readout for my external air filtration unit tanked straight to 0 in real time. A high-pitched, shrieking warning buzzer threatened to bore a hole straight through my skull. I forced my gauntlet closed, snapping the jammed external circulation valve. With a sharp click, I manually rerouted the oxygen feed to my armor's internal emergency tanks. A blast of chilled, pure oxygen finally flooded my bursting trachea. Gripping the metal edge of the ramp, I dragged myself to my feet. My fingertips hooked around the textured grip of my kinetic rifle. The fire control computer's targeting reticle instantly locked onto the bare chest of that old human. I had survived the shockwaves of 7 supernovas. I had commanded fleets that crushed the defensive lines of 17 distinct civilizations. I didn't need a plasma shield. I could snap this lesser carbon-based lifeform's neck with my bare hands. Just as my finger brushed the trigger, a violent gust of wind reeking of dead fish slammed into me sideways. Ghastly white, hyper-concentrated salt dust instantly plastered my helmet visor. It surged down the kinetic rifle's cooling grills and packed into the barrel. The weapon's internal firing circuitry immediately spat out a shower of tiny blue sparks. I instinctively raised an arm to brush the dust away, but thick layers of acidic white salt had already bonded to my gleaming kinetic armor, plating that had once tanked an antimatter artillery barrage. A teeth-setting sizzle bypassed the armor's load-bearing skeleton and drilled straight into my jaw. I stared at the real-time feed from my external sensors. Those blindingly white acid crystals were relentlessly chewing through my antimatter-resistant silver plating. The dense, nano-molecular layer blackened and blistered right before my eyes. Then it curled and peeled off like scorched tinfoil, hitting the black mud at my feet and hissing violently as it vented acrid yellow smoke. I reached up to wipe the salt sludge off my visor. The armor plating on my knuckles had already been eaten down to a deep pit, leaking glowing green coolant. All around the drop pod's edge, the distress alarms of my 5 paralyzed elites wailed in a chaotic chorus. Their joint servos were packed solid with stark white salt crystals. They couldn't even transmit a command to twitch a finger. That shirtless old man didn't spare us a single glance. He just hooked a finger beneath a grease-stained rag resting on his collarbone and pulled it up over his sun-spotted face. His rubber boots slapped into the bubbling black mud. With a few strides, he was ankle-deep in the toxic soup. He swung a long-handled net across the surface, easily snagging a bloated, discarded tire. The kinetic rifle slung at my side suddenly popped with a chain of blue sparks, its dust-choked control panel going dead black. Yellow smoke from my dissolved armor scraps drifted up my shins. My destroyed external filters couldn't block that choking, putrid stench anymore. The pressure gauge on my emergency oxygen tank was plunging wildly into the red. The white salt packed in the elite's joints ground out horrific shrieks as they twitched uncontrollably. The overlapping alarms were about to blow out the speakers in my audio module. The old man casually chucked the salvaged tire onto the muddy bank behind him. He flicked his net again to grab a floating metal drum. He hadn't fired a single shot at us. He hadn't paused his routine for even a fraction of a second. To him, our squad of interstellar artillery-hardened dreadnoughts was fundamentally no different from the dead fish and rotting plastic floating around his boots. I practically roared my tactical orders into the squad's shared comms. All units engage anti-grav boots immediately. Max output. Fall back to the pod. The 5 kinetic armors paralyzed in the mud hummed simultaneously. Power core readouts spiked from standby to 30% in a heartbeat. The fine salt crystals jammed in their exhaust vents, baked rapidly under the heated airflow, dehydrating and solidifying. Flurries of white salt sprayed out of the exhaust ports. I gripped the stock of my thoroughly dead kinetic rifle, trying to use it as a crutch to stand. The salt caked on my visor turned sticky in the drifting yellow clouds of hydrogen sulfide. Even the sloshing water from the old man fishing out a barrel 3 meters away pierced my audio modules with agonizing clarity. Power output hit 70%. The external casings of the anti-grav boots on the 2 frontline operatives instantly glowed a molten iron red. Thick plumes of corrosive black smoke jettisoned from their ventilation seams. Their core readouts blew right past the 120% red line. 2 muffled detonations followed. The half-ton kinetic suit's face planted stiffly into the knee-deep sludge. Highly acidic mud, thick with rotted fish bones, immediately flooded into their transmission joints through the gaps chewed open by the salt. The remaining 3 operatives panicked and slashed their power output to 0. The hum of their anti-grav boots died instantly. Stripped of lift, their armors slid half a meter down the muddy incline. Their shoulder and neck joints, already seized by the salt, let out a sickening crunch. They locked up completely, turning into rigid iron tombs. They couldn't even rotate their helmets. I shoved my weight down onto the dead rifle. The acid-brittled stocks snapped clean in 2. My center of gravity pitched, and I nearly face-planted into the toxic muck. The side of my visor was less than an inch away from the rotting sludge. I slammed my shoulder pauldron hard against the mud to arrest the momentum of my half-ton armor. The alloy plating at the point of impact immediately sizzled, bubbling into a searing white scar. Ignoring the burning agony, I dragged my gauntlet to my waist holster. My fingertips, slick with green coolant, swiped across the quantum communicator's unlock panel. The moment I pressed down, the holographic display, which should have projected a star map, exploded into a blinding storm of static. A high-frequency screech vibrated through my bone conduction implants, splitting my skull. I hammered my fist against the panel, pushing the comms gain to 3 times its theoretical maximum. A wisp of scorched blue smoke drifted out of the casing's vents. The frequency scanner swept through every known interstellar wavelength, but it couldn't catch a single bite of the Mother Fleet's beacon. The coolant in my spine ran ice-cold. Beneath this god-forsaken wasteland lay a massive, natural salt crystal layer. Its innate magnetic field was suffocating all quantum signals dead in the air above the swamp. Nothing was getting through. In my peripheral vision, I scanned my 3 paralyzed subordinates. The red distress lights on their helmets were flashing so fast they blurred into a solid crimson glare. Even the data streams transmitting their vitals were starting to drop frames. The sluggish sound of boots squelching in mud approached from 3 paces away. I fought my stiff neck to turn my head. The shirtless old man had hoisted the salvaged tire onto his shoulder. The greasy rag on his chin bobbed with the movement, revealing a row of yellow, smoke-stained teeth. Half-rotted fish lay tangled in the acid mud by his boots. The salt dust kicked up by his tread was too heavy to even float, immediately falling back into the slime. He didn't even look at the glaring high-energy weapon warnings flashing on my armor. His eyes were as dead flat as if he were passing empty beer cans in his own backyard. He paused for half a second next to my half-ton kinetic rig. I tried to force my servo motors to raise an arm and shove him back. The salt packed in my joints shrieked like metal, tearing metal. My arm froze mid-air, refusing to move a single inch. I watched helplessly as he turned his head toward my helmet, which was smeared with yellow soot and salt dust. He'd puff his cheeks and spat a massive loogie right at me. That wad of tobacco-laced spit smacked dead center onto my visor. My first instinct was to trigger the surface micro-pulse cleaning protocol. Normally, that high-frequency vibration pulverized micrometeorites. But instead of shaking the phlegm off, I heard a terrifying, microscopic cracking sound beneath the scratch-resistant coating. That sticky, foul liquid was seeping into the hairline fractures left by the acid fog. It was loudly melting a ring of milky white corrosion straight into my viewport. My logic processing module, tempered by 3 centuries of galactic conquest, hard crashed into a fatal loop. This armor had survived the direct glare of stellar flares. It had taken volley fire from dreadnought main cannons. And my final line of defense was just breached by the bodily fluid of a carbon-based biped. The putrid stench of hydrogen sulfide immediately bled through the corroded micropores into my helmet. The pressure valve on my emergency oxygen tank jerked violently, the needle burying itself another half-notch into the red zone. I tried to scream at the surviving 3 soldiers to lock down their internal atmospheric loops. But my vocal drive module was so jammed with salt crystals it couldn't form a complete syllable. All I could hear was the deafening, overlapping shriek of proximity alarms. Green coolant bled from their shoulder joints, dripping into the acid mud and throwing up clusters of tiny, fizzing bubbles. Data streams flooded the edges of my vision. Every pre-programmed tactical response had failed. Even the basic Identify Friend-Foe system was throwing continuous error codes. I watched helplessly as the white ring of rot on my visor spread wider. As the rot crept across my viewport, the overlapping alarms were suddenly pierced by a shrill thermal warning. The moment the Salton Sea sun breached the salt-crusted horizon, the armor's external temperature readout spiked from 40 degrees straight, past 70. Where my leaking pauldron touched the acid mud, the bubbling tripled in intensity. Even the salt-clogged servos were venting foul-smelling, acidic white steam. The heat was trapped inside my hermetically sealed suit. Hydrogen sulfide churned in the rising thermal currents within my helmet. My lungs felt like they were being scrubbed raw with acid-soaked steel wool. The oxygen pressure gauge clicked loudly, burying itself into the deepest dead end of the red zone. Unable to turn my neck, I used my peripherals to check the 3 paralyzed armors next to me. Their thermal exhaust grills had been choked solid by the salt dust. Not a breath of air could vent. The blazing red distress strobes from their helmets painted the surrounding mud a horrifying crimson. Their vital sign telemetry was jumping so violently it practically burned a hole in my tactical feed. A wisp of scorched protein drifted from the chest plate seams of the furthest soldier. A second later, the helmets of all 3 struggling operatives slumped simultaneously. Their vitals flatlined instantly. Only thread-like shock pulses flickered on the screen, barely keeping them technically alive. I threw everything I had into forcing my vocal module to broadcast a warning. The ground salt shrieked inside my vocoder. Only a pathetic, breathy hiss escaped my valves. I couldn't form a single word. The old man had just tossed his junk into the bed of his pickup. Adjusting his dirty mask, he shot me a sideways glance like I was a dying prairie dog on the shoulder of the highway. He kicked a dead fish out of his way and ambled toward the driver's side. My if system was still freaking out, tagging the old man's retreating back as an absolute apocalypse-level threat. My own biofluids mixed with the leaked hydrogen sulfide, stinging the sensory organs behind my optical lenses. The wind suddenly tasted different. On the edge of the horizon, a towering wall of sickly yellow-brown reared up. A wave of briny foul dust was bearing down on us fast. The salty sandblast hit my corroding visor first. Microscopic acid salts and pulverized fish bones drove themselves deep into the armor's seams. The hydrogen sulfide reading inside my helmet pegged at maximum. My emergency O2 valve emitted a screech that felt like a drill to my neural interface. Driven by the friction of boiling sand, the armor shell spiked to 72 degrees Celsius. The very last drop of green coolant in my shoulder line sizzled out into nothing. Gripping my broken kinetic rifle, I desperately dragged my knuckles toward the drop pod's emergency reboot switch. Just as I touched the panel's edge, a fistful of fine salt drove into the gaps around the button. Behind me, the 30-ton landing pod's struggling main engine let out a pathetic groan, like a steel axle being sawed in half by a butter knife. Every exterior floodlight died instantly. The auxiliary power flickered 3 times, then went pitch black. The scorched blue smoke from my quantum communicator was whipped away by the sandstorm. Every tactical screen faded to dead black. Even the deafening warning klaxon that had been vibrating my skull for 5 minutes degraded into sputtering, static fuzz. Suddenly, a low-frequency, gut-rattling combustion sound ripped through the howling sandstorm. The vibrations shook the salt right out of my armor's crevices. There was no smooth, high-energy resonance to it. Every detonation sounded like a primordial beast chewing on raw metal. Even the acid mud beneath my feet began to ripple with tight, erratic vibrations. I burned my very last microjoule of power to fire up a single optical sensor. Looking out through the expanding rot stain on my visor, I saw a hulking, rust-flaking monstrosity plowing through the dust. Its 4 tires were caked in 2 inches of salty sludge. Thick, jet-black diesel exhaust belched from its pipe, instantly swallowing whatever blue smoke my comms unit had left. The junk tires stacked in its bed slammed against the tailgate with every violent bump. As it rolled over the 2 frontline soldiers who had detonated in the mud, those hard rubber tires crunched their compromised antimatter-rated armor into unrecognizable scrap. All of my remaining processing threads completely locked up. This dumb, clunky iron beast didn't emit a single trace of plasma runoff or quantum fluctuation. It was propelled entirely by the most primitive chemical combustion of diesel fuel. And yet, it was crushing my Vanguard tier kinetic armor like stale crackers. It flashed a crude turn signal, the rear wheels kicking up waist-high waves of toxic sludge, and threw itself into reverse. The dim yellow halogen reverse lights glared through the toxic sand like the cloudy eyes of a dying beast. With a thunderous smash, its rear bumper slammed right into the flank of our 30-ton drop pod. An entire meteor-resistant alloy panel, already loosened by the acid, was sheared clean off. It splashed heavily into the bubbling mud. The rust bucket pickup door creaked open. Earl hopped out, his bare torso dusted with salt. 1 foot sank into the muck, but he didn't even wobble. The cheap cigarette hanging from his lips showered sparks in the howling storm. The greasy rag flapped wildly against his stained chest. He leaned into the truck bed and gave a massive heave. An explosive rattle of metal sent violent tremors through my few surviving sensors. He had just hauled out a heavy-duty towing chain, its links thicker than my wrists. The sharp clatter of iron striking iron drowned out the diesel engine's idle. Flakes of rust snowed down from the heavy links. He stomped through the bone-laced acid mud toward the pod. His rubber soles walked right over the shattered remains of my 2 exploded men. The brittle, heat-resistant alloy just flattened under his boots. I slammed my fist against my dead control panel like a lunatic, begging the magnetic defense grid to wake up. But the black screen didn't even give me a spark. The shields that used to deflect deep space micrometeors were deader than my squad. He crouched down, his heavily calloused hands grabbing the freezing iron chain. He began wrapping it loop by loop around the pod's protruding gravity stabilizer fin. The rusted edges of the chain dragged across our meteor-grade hull, carving pale white gashes into the alloy. The acid fog eagerly licked at the scratches, bubbling with fresh corrosion. He was rough handling it like he was tying down a pile of rotted firewood on his farm. After 3 tight loops, he slammed a heavy U-shackle into place. With a sharp click, he locked the pin and violently yanked the chain tight. My surviving optical sensor zoomed in 10 times on that taut, rusty chain. My cache instantly flooded with hundreds of critical logic errors. I've served 3 galactic conquest cycles. I've seen plating survive supernovas. I've seen force fields deflect antimatter warheads. But my entire tactical database didn't have a single parameter for defending against pure, unenergized, unshielded raw steel. I frantically smashed my 2 functioning fingers against the dead panel. The deep pit on my knuckle bled green coolant all over the cockpit. I tried to draw even a fraction of reserve shield energy, but I couldn't scrape together a single milliamp. This piece of primitive, rusted trash was just wedged into the seams of the gravity fin, its fresh scratches sizzling in the acid fog. I watched Earl click the other U-shackle onto the towing hitch of his rear bumper. He gave it 2 hard tugs to check the bite. A clump of ash fell from his cigarette into the toxic mud. He casually pulled his mask up over his mouth, dropped a calloused hand onto the steering wheel, and pressed a mud-caked boot gently onto the throttle. The diesel engine let out a deep, thunderous roar. The massive iron chain pulled dead taut, slamming all of that kinetic tension straight into the gravity fin. The shock wave traveled up the hull and directly into my bones. My last 2 working fingers went entirely numb. Every unbroken needle gauge on my dash pegged the limiters. Stray sparks danced across the dead consoles. My 3 cycles of galactic tactical data dissolved into complete gibberish. It couldn't generate a single frame of predictive modeling for this. I had never seen a lesser civilization use a diesel-burning lump of iron to tow a 30-ton, meteor-resistant landing pod. A piercing screech of tearing metal erupted. The chain bit deep into the scarred alloy, brutally chewing a deep gorge into the hull. The trapped acid fog exploded into a frenzy of corrosive bubbles inside the gouge. I squeezed my processors dry, looking for shield power. Nothing. I could only watch as the 30-ton pod was dragged sideways like a weightless empty tin can. The half-dry salt crust beneath the pod was plowed into knee-deep trenches. Dark brown mud and fish guts churned into a filthy wave, slamming against the hull. The meteor-grade landing struts snapped like twigs, bent completely in half by sheer brute force. The pickup's engine growled deeper, pumping black soot right into my visor's vents. The hydrogen sulfide readings spiked off the charts. The emergency O2 needle danced violently in the red. The entire pod suddenly lurched downward. The hard salt crust under the belly finally gave way. I could feel the pod sliding into deeper waters, dragged by the momentum. Thick, hyper-concentrated acid instantly swallowed the lower half of the hull. A freezing, corrosive dread seeped in through the hairline fractures. The moment the ruined stock of my kinetic rifle touched the rising acid, its heat-resistant coating boiled away. As the pod sank deeper and the acid breached the hull, the sizzling sounded like 10,000 xenomorphs gnawing on a carcass. It completely drowned out the truck's roaring engine. My numb fingers brushed the dead console, and stray sparks sent jolts of burning agony straight up my neural pathways into my logic core. The kinetic rifle at my feet was melting like wax, collapsing into the toxic puddle. Every warning light in the cabin flashed once and died. Only the ambient red strobe in my helmet remained. The O2 needle was dead. The sulfide concentration was critically maxed. My logic module tripped its overload breakers 3 times in a row. In the corner, the bodies of my 3 surviving operatives gave one last violent shudder before the extreme heat and toxic gas of the Salton Sea forced them into comas. Their telemetry flatlined. Corrupted by the acid, the sensors spit out gibberish, forcefully registering their faint shock pulses as a false death state. I scoured my glitched database for 3 seconds and somehow scraped together 17 milliamps of backup power in the comms unit. Not even enough to boot the holographic screen, but just enough to fire a directional encrypted pulse. It would bypass local quantum relays and launch a highest priority sitrep straight toward the Mother Fleet's warp coordinates. My trembling fingers danced over the salt-crusted keys, punching in bites one by one. Acid washed over my ankles. The seals on my boots dissolved audibly. Corrosive fog poured in. Diesel soot from the truck drifted through the melting hull, mixing with the foul reek in my helmet and tearing my last shred of pride to absolute ribbons. Shaking, I pushed the highest priority transmission. Do not approach Earth. This is a maximum-level toxic, no-contact quarantine zone. The motherboard cracked, spraying blue sparks. That last surge fried the circuitry entirely. Every light went dark. The klaxons choked out mid-scream. Acid was up to my thighs. The rifle at my feet melted into the dark water, bubbling away into nothing. The toxic gas pouring into my helmet caused green blood to stream from my chin. The oxygen gauge was pinned at 0. My lungs felt like they had swallowed a stellar corona. The hull shrieked as it was dragged. Whole chunks of armor plating sloughed off into the muck. I blindly felt for the manual release valve. The salt ground my fingertips to a bloody pulp before I finally yanked the rusted lever open. With a dull thud, the pressure differential blew the hatch wide open. A wave of rotten fish and crystallized acid washed over my helmet. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't even consider triggering self-destruct. Those circuits were long gone anyway. I tossed the hollowed-out frame of my rifle into the mud. Raising 2 pitted, mangled mechanical hands, I waded out of the half-sunken pod into the knee-deep acid. The pickup idled in the distance, blowing a mix of diesel and decay my way. Earl leaned against the driver's door. His mask was pulled down, his cigarette burnt to the filter. He watched me step out with my hands up. He flicked his butt into the sludge, twirled a grease-stained adjustable wrench, and trudged through the mud toward me. I held my mechanical hands high for 3 agonizing minutes. It wasn't until the acid fog completely ate through my visor's last layer of sealant that I dared to believe my 17 milliamp warning had successfully crossed 3 light years. I could vividly picture the command bridge of the expeditionary flagship. 6 red dots representing the vanguard squad vanishing from the tactical map. The Supreme Commander crushing the control yoke with his cybernetic grip. 17 seconds of dead silence on the fleet's public channel. Then a synchronized maximum priority red alert flashing across every star map, flagging the blue rock known as Earth as an absolute no-fly toxic quarantine zone. The warp drive navigation locks violently welded shut. Nobody would ever dare plot a course within half a parsec of this corner of the 3rd spiral arm again. The wind blasted salty sand against my exposed neck, stinging my chemical-burned skin. I stiffly turned my head, my pupils shrinking violently. The 5 elite soldiers who had flatlined and been flagged as dead by the corrupted systems were slumped side by side on the muddy bank. They weren't dead, but their kinetic armors were wrapped tight in heavy iron chains. Dehydrated and poisoned, they lacked the strength to twitch a single finger. This god-forsaken Earth wasteland hadn't just destroyed our armor, it had completely blinded our state-of-the-art biotelemetry. The diesel roar of the F-150 rumbled close. Earl hit the brakes, parking right next to the sunken pod. He brandished a brightly burning acetylene torch in one hand, and with the greasy wrench in the other, he casually rapped on the surviving heat-resistant plating of my pauldron. My raised mechanical arms were so stiff the joints threatened to snap. My visor's last seal disintegrated. Toxic fog flooded my respiratory tract. Green blood dripped down my exposed neck into the mud, hissing as it formed tiny craters. Earl tapped my shoulder again. The very last circuit board in my suit snapped in half with a crisp click. My rig couldn't squeeze out another electron if it tried. He swept the acetylene torch along the edge of my armor, scorching a curled black burn mark into it. I twitched uncontrollably from the pain. He completely ignored my trembling surrender. Dragging his heavy chain, he walked over to my 5 elites, spraying rotting fish mud everywhere. He took his wrench to what was left of their joint locks, smashing them apart. With every shattered lock, he wrapped them 3 more times in chain. In under 10 minutes, he had all 6 of our half-ton battle chassis strung up neatly like a line of fish, the tail end hooked firmly to the bumper of his F-150. The diesel engine roared with a rough, tearing sound. The pickup dragged us through the sludge, cutting deep ruts. The sound of tires crushing fish bones echoed the whole way. 20 minutes later, I saw a massive pile of scrap metal. A rusted blue sign read Southern California Scrap and Salvage, with half the letters in sail missing. Earl hopped out, torching what was left of our drop pod. The hull plating that had shrugged off asteroid impacts melted off like butter under his torch. He chucked the cut steel onto the scale, watched the numbers spin, and stuffed a wad of crumpled greenbacks into his greasy overalls. He didn't even spare our kinetic armor. Using a crowbar, he pried off whatever heat-resistant plating the salt fog hadn't eaten and tossed it into the truck bed. By the end of it, all 6 of us were stripped completely of our outer shells. We were left in nothing but our squishy pressure-rated undersuits, baking naked under the 72-degree Salton Sea sun. He tucked the wrench into his belt. Tilting his chin, he pointed toward a vast expanse of toxic mud choked with scrap metal and dead fish. The cold steel of his wrench caught the blinding California sun, stinging my acid-burned retinas. He didn't waste words. He hooked a finger through our lead chain, dragging us toward the dead fish swamp like 6 crippled old goats. The 5 surviving elites had been stripped of everything. Every time the chain pulled, their joints popped, squeezing out pathetic whimpers from their throats. Like me, they didn't have a single amp of power left. We could only watch as the old man treated our stellar-grade hulls like scrapyard fodder. The chain wore through our soft undersuits. Hyper-concentrated salt dust drove straight into our skin, setting every nerve on fire. The 5 elites groaned as their joints popped under the strain. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't even lift their eyelids. Earl stepped to the edge of the muck, crushing a salt crystal underfoot with a sharp snap. He looped the head of the chain 3 times around an old rusted drill pipe on the bank. A heavy 3-pound iron padlock slammed onto the chain. The lock itself was coated in impenetrable crusts of salt. He crouched down and tapped his wrench 3 times against my shattered helmet shell. A wave of cheap tobacco and diesel hit my face. He spoke with a thick, gravelly drawl. From now on, y'all wade into the mud at dawn to pick copper. Dead fish get piled over yonder for fertilizer. Y'all hit 200 pounds of scrap by the end of the week. I'll pour a cold beer down your throats. You slack off him dragging your asses to the foundry and melting you down for slag. I stared at the dead, belly-up carp floating in the muck. The stark white salt crystals clinging to its scales made me dizzy. 3 light years away, the high command elites sitting in their climate-controlled bridges would never get my follow-up report. They would never know that the Vanguard squad, capable of tanking supernova radiation and conquering 3 galaxies, couldn't even leave behind an intact corpse. We were chained to a toxic swamp by a crazy old man at the Salton Sea, condemned to be his permanent scrap sorters. The wind whipped the salt dust past me. The very last remnants of my Visa seal crumbled into powder. Thick, bitter hydrogen sulfide poured straight into my throat. In the distance, Earl's Ford F-150 roared like a beast. As it sped off kicking up dust, the neatly stacked alien heat-resistant plating in its bed caught the brutal California sun, flashing a blinding, brilliant light.
Hell yeah, guys. Can we just take a second to appreciate the absolute disrespect here? This dude literally survived supernovas, only to get his billion-dollar star armor melted by the Salton Sea and towed away by a rusty F-150 like a piece of dead farm equipment. Earl didn't even drop his cigarette. That is some peak Florida man in California energy right there. So, I gotta ask, if an elite alien strike force crash landed in your hometown tomorrow, what local piece of junk are you using to ruin their whole career? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe for more badass sci-fi, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.